Settle down, brother. This is the Quarter Report powered by ENCA.com. South Africa is a movie. Welcome to the watch party. The singular crisis that upsets and occupies most South Africans right now is crime. Crime is really bad in this country. Many different kinds of crimes are really prevalent in this country, but there are a lot of different theories and beliefs about why crime is so bad. And so on today's show, we're going to talk about two things related to our current crime crisis, because actually all kinds of crime were broadly going down and happening less up until about 2011. We were all on our best behavior during the 2010 World Cup, but after the 2010 World Cup, something happened, and that caused a long-running and massive increase in all kinds of crime. And that thing, by the way, was Jacob Zuma and Jacob Zuma's administration. If you're already getting touched in the comments because you're a big Jacob Zuma fan, just wait and hear me out, because the data is really clear. And the other thing that happened is long-running consequences of decisions that South Africa made over how to run our prison system started to affect the country and the people who are incarcerated more and more. Because it turns out the way that South Africa has been doing our prison system, particularly around something called mandatory minimum sentences, it has not helped in the fight against crime at all. In fact, it seems more and more as though the evidence is suggesting that has made crime worse. As always, the only place to watch the show in full is on ENCA.com. If you're watching on YouTube, click on the link in the description. There's another link there to 3beaniesnetwork.com where you can buy some of our merchandise at www.3beaniesnetwork.com. So a broad overview of crime in modern South Africa. Many people believe that just after 1994, into democracy, there was a huge surge, a huge wave in crime. And actually, the data is not clear about that. In terms of the data, there was no dramatic and significant surge in crime in the 90s. What was true is that at the end of apartheid, there was a lot of violence in South Africa. There was a simmering, some people call almost a civil war. There was third force stuff. There was violence between police and violence between protesters. There was violence between the Inkatha Freedom Party and the ANC. There was lots and lots and lots of violence. But from 1994, most crimes went down as more and more South Africans started to believe in a police force that worked for them and wasn't out to get them, because the apartheid state used the police force to criminalize being black and being in opposition to apartheid. And that there would now be more opportunities for them to escape poverty and gain wealth and have secure and fulfilling lives in the normal legal economic order and economic system, because a new South Africa promised all of that. And so all kinds of crimes went down in South Africa all the way through until about 2011, even though in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was this belief that crime was getting a lot worse, that there was this uptick and huge surge in all kinds of crimes. Some people put that down to hangovers from apartheid's propaganda campaign called the Swart Gevaar, trying to convince white South Africans that black people were fundamentally criminal, fundamentally violent, fundamentally dangerous, and out to get them. And the Swart Gevaar hangover into the new South Africa was white South Africans going, oh no, suddenly black people have power. We are now in danger because the apartheid state apparatus is no longer there to protect us from the Swart Gevaar. And then from 2011, pretty much ever since then, there has been a steady uptake in all kinds of crimes, violent and serious in particular, but also petty crimes. And the obvious reason why that happened was Jacob Zuma, during his presidency, hollowed out the crime-fighting units and organizations that were supposed to combat crime. Policing was hollowed out and corrupted. The National Prosecuting Authority was hollowed out and corrupted and compromised and captured. Specialist crime-fighting forces were also hollowed out, corrupted, and captured. This is all very, very clear from all of the investigations, the State Capture Commission and otherwise, since then. And even if you want to tell me that there's some extraordinary grand conspiracy against Jacob Zuma and that none of this is true, and you would have to defy so much evidence. Even if you tried to deny all of that, Jacob Zuma's administration oversaw a collapse of the state's ability to fight crime, and so a surge in crime. And we are still, even today, dealing with the fallout of all of that. And it puts into context the Madlanga Commission. It puts into context all of General Mkhwanazi's allegations against Sinzimkhulu police minister. So that's the one reason for the uptick in crime from about 2011 is the hollowing out of the police force and the state security forces, which were supposed to be fighting against crime. Another thing that happened is that more and more South Africans who were impoverished like more and more years into the new South Africa, realized that the government was failing to help them, was not coming to save them, was not providing them education opportunities or work opportunities or housing opportunities or food opportunities, and so started to get more and more hopeless and despairing and desperate. And the positive energy from the 90s and the 2000s, where more South Africans, particularly black South Africans, impoverished ones, felt like they were going to get a new life and new opportunities in life from the new South Africa, that dream and that hope started to crack and crumble. And as people became more and more desperate, there was also a financial crisis in the late 2000s that contributed in a bunch of ways. That was around the world. More and more South Africans were forced into committing crimes to survive. So that started to happen. But there's a third thing that happens, and it's like a bit of a double-edged sword when your policing gets hollowed out, corrupting, and captured. Because firstly, that means that the police are less good at fighting criminals. But secondly, as people start to realize that the police is hollowed out, corrupted, and captured, more people take the risk of committing crimes because they feel like they're not going to get caught. When you believe, and there's a perception in society that the police is useless, more people are willing to risk committing crimes because they don't think that they're going to get caught and suffer any consequences for that. And that's going to lead us into the prison conversation in a second. But there's something that I really need you to understand that's super important, is that data after data, research after research from all kinds of countries around the world consistently shows that certainty, not severity, causes people to not risk committing crimes. In general, when someone's deciding whether or not to commit a crime, they're thinking about whether or not they'll be caught, not how harsh their punishment will be if they are caught. So many people argue that the death penalty should exist in South Africa because people will be so scared of being killed by the state, like literally suffering the death penalty themselves, that they won't commit crimes. But in many places around the world where the death penalty was there and then has been taken away, or wasn't there and then has been put in place, there's been virtually no effect on how much crime was committed in those places. And it's because people aren't thinking, I'm going to get the death penalty. They're thinking, am I going to be caught? And from 2011, as more and more people started to realize that Jacob Zuma's administration was corrupt and capturing the state and hollowing out our security forces, more and more people were willing to try and commit crimes because they didn't think that they would be caught. And now let's talk about prisons. I am reading such a good book right now. It's called Behind Prison Walls. It's by three excellent legal minds, one of them a total legend, Justice Edwin Cameron, co-written with two brilliant legal scholars, thinkers and practitioners, Rebecca Gore and Sahela Surajpal. It's about the history of South Africa's prisons and how they are now and what's working and what is not. But this book is really phenomenal at talking about where South Africa went wrong with our prison system. So remember earlier, I said that in the 90s, there wasn't a huge surge in crime in South Africa, but people thought that there was. That informed a lot of politicians by the time the 2000s came around, feeling like they should create incredibly harsh prison sentencing in order to dissuade crime. This was also happening at a time where the Americans, who were incredibly influential in the 90s and the 2000s, were doing the war on drugs, and they were doing like harsh sentencing, and they were doing something called mandatory minimum sentences. And that thinking, that philosophy was incredibly influential around the world, and it was influential here in South Africa. So what the South African state then did, twice or thrice in temporary ways, and then it became permanent, is they said, we are going to create something called mandatory minimum sentences. And that satisfied a lot of people in South Africa. Mandatory minimum sentences, if you do a certain kind of crime, the minimum amount of years you get is this amount, 15 years for this, 20 years for this, 25 to life for this. If you are a repeat serious offender, this is the minimum number of years. It's very hard to get parole. You can't get parole early. It basically causes people to spend a hell of a long time in prison. And I'm not trying to make you take the side of would-be murderers and rapists and committers of serious crimes. But this discussion, prisons, is about how we deal with people who've committed crimes and very, very, very serious crimes. And what this book writes about really well is about mandatory minimum sentences and how that policy has actually screwed our prison system and not made South Africa safer. As I said earlier, mandatory minimum sentences of longer sentences do not cause crime to go down. If they did, then South Africa would have less crime than South Africa has now, because we've had these mandatory minimum sentences and they did not have an effect on crime being committed less in this country or committed less today. In fact, as crime has gone up in South Africa in the last 15 years, a smaller percentage of people who commit serious crimes are ending up in jail, right? Because I think one of the stats is only 1 in 10 people who commit a murder in South Africa actually end up incarcerated in jail. There are actually not that many people, it's a small percentage of the number of people committing crimes, actually end up in jail. But then why are our prisons overcrowded? And why are they so awful and under-resourced? Well, it's because people who are convicted of serious crimes have to stay in jail for a much, much, much longer period of time. Now, that may make you happy. You may think, okay, in terms of a punishment and retribution idea about justice, these criminals should go away forever and they deserve it. If that is something that you subscribe to, I'm not going to talk much more about that, because what I'm actually going to talk about is the other two functions of long sentencing and prisons, right? Prisons are supposed to make your community safer, right? You remove dangerous people. And something that I learned from this book, which is so interesting that I didn't know, the older you get, the less likely you are to commit a serious, violent crime. And so when you think about that with mandatory minimum sentencing, by the time somebody's been in jail for 10 years, if you let them out, they are so much less likely to commit a crime in terms of time spent in jail. And it actually doesn't make a huge difference whether they spend an extra 10 years in jail in terms of how likely they are to commit a crime, because they are aging anyway. But then you got to think about the fact that the other goal of a prison is, once somebody finishes their sentence, that they leave and rejoin South African life in a positive manner, right? Rehabilitation, like whether they get an education, whether they show that they are remorseful, that they're not going to commit these crimes again. And the longer somebody stays in a prison in South Africa, the more likely they are to end up being the victims of violent crime within prisons, the more likely they are to have to join a gang in a prison to survive, the more likely they are to end up in criminality, because they are in these prisons that are poorly regulated for much, much longer, which makes them more likely to come out of jail traumatized, violated, victims of crime, and more likely to join a criminal network when they leave that jail, because this is now the life they've been indoctrinated into, and sometimes they can't leave those criminal networks anyway. That's really serious. Like, that's a really big deal. And it's something that we should really think about very seriously as a consequence of keeping people in jail for much longer. And then the other crazy thing that I learned in this book, so crazy. Did you know that over 30% of the people in South Africa's jails are awaiting trial? Over 30%, which means people could, and our justice system is overburdened. Court cases take a long time to happen. Dockets go missing, all this kind of stuff. People can spend a long time in jail awaiting trial, where they're not getting rehabilitation, where they're not getting decent quality of life because they're awaiting trial, but they could be awaiting trial for months, 2 years, suffering in jail, families suffering out of jail. They haven't even been found guilty yet. They may be found innocent, but they're being exposed to these awful prisons, these overburdened prisons, these criminal networks within prisons, and they are suffering and becoming victims of the prison system while awaiting trial.